Real estate investment practice problem using Excel. Amortization table template. Get ready because we're raising the stakes with real estate. Here we are in our Excel worksheet. If you have access to the Excel worksheet, would like to follow along, note down below we have two tabs, a T1 tab, a T1F tab, standing for Template 1 and Template 1 with extra formatting tabs. The extra formatting having some fancy formatting, which can be nice, but also comes with some restrictions and problems we'll talk about shortly. The idea of the templates being that we want to put something together that can be useful, at least as a starting point, to have what people might need in order to make different comparisons and adjust the formats of their loans so they can make comparisons with them. So we got the T1 tab and the T1F tab. If you were to use the template, I would suggest using it in some format like this, opening it up, possibly creating another tab, copying a tab over so that you don't distort the first one, and then make your adjustments in a copied tab. So I might hold down Control on the keyboard and then left click on this tab down below and drag it to the right. That's the easiest way that I know of to copy it. You'll get the name down here of T1 number 2. You might then label it as your first adjustment or loan 1 or something like that, example 1, and then you can populate your information. The information we have up top, the areas in blue this time represent items that are most likely for you to be able to change. Everything else that's not in blue, for the most part, will populate on its own, although everything is open, so if you wanted to change anything else, you can do so as well. But that's going to be the idea of it. We've got the information on the left-hand side, amortization table populating on the right. It is in the format of a table. That means you can use the filters, and you can add a slicer if you want to add the slicer to it. We're going to do an IRR calculation, which should populate automatically just as an idea of how you can use that tool, possibly then using it in more detail later. And then we're going to have the table, the pivot table on the right that's already been populated. And then you can use the pivot table, hopefully, to make adjustments and see it on a year-by-year basis. So, for example, on the information on the left-hand side, the home amount, if we change the home amount, let's say it was like $400,000, we might populate that. We have the down payment, which is something that we're going to keep at 20, but it might be something else. You might say like 10% if something is happening and you're able to put 10% down or something. The down payment calculates automatically. That's why it's not blue. It's going to calculate automatically. But if you just want to put the down payment in there, you can do so if you want to manually put it in there. The loan amount in there calculates automatically, the $400,000 minus the 40. But again, if you didn't want this starting information, you just want to start at the loan of like $300,000. Just say, I just want to start right there, $300,000, and go from there. You can do so. The whole worksheet is flexible. So then we've got the years, the standard loan, oftentimes 30-year, but you could change that to whatever you want as well. That's why it's blue. If it was a 15-year or something like that, you can populate it. It would then populate the number of months, just taking the years times 12 to get to 180 in this case. If it was a 30-year, getting to the 360. So that should populate automatically, which is why it's not blue. We have the rate that you could think about. This is kind of like the starting rate that we would have, and then try to make any adjustments you might have to it for things like lender credits maybe, or points that you might be calculating. So this is one way that you can look at the rate, populating the rate at whatever rate it is, 5% starting point. Then the effective rate. We've done two calculations of the effective rate. This is similar to like the APR kind of calculation we've seen in prior presentations, but you might use it in slightly different ways when you're doing different comparisons, as we've seen in prior presentations. We have one here, the effective rate without the closing costs included, and one with the closing costs. So in other words, if you're doing comparisons between two different loans and you're saying, okay, I think the closing costs are going to be about the same, so maybe I want to just compare, the rates without the closing costs and assume the closing costs are going to be somewhat the same and compare it that way. It might be a little bit easier because you don't have to roll in the closing cost to the rate. Or if you're dealing with two different loans that are structured where the closing costs are substantially different and the rates are different or something like that, then you might want to include the closing costs into an effective rate calculation to do a better comparison. So, for example, if you had closing costs down here, which were like 4% of the loan amount, let's say, then this calculation down below is going to try to roll those closing costs in to give you a rate that you can then compare with other loans and see what their rate is would be if they rolled in the closing costs. So if they had different rates, but the closing costs were substantially different or something like that, then that's what that comparison would be helpful for. And then this one will not have the closing costs, so that if you're just trying to compare different components of the loan, then it might be easier to not, use the closing costs. Then we have the lender credit down below. So the lender credit would be the idea of basically having an increased rate and having the lender credit go towards the closing costs that we talked about in a prior presentation. Then we have the points. Now the points, we got some of the point calculations. If it was like 1 to 3 points, are fairly standard, points being, as we saw, a percentage of the loan amount, so we can see what the points fees would be. And then the reduction in the points may not be as standardized, so you might need to know what that would be. And then for that calculation, again, you could basically see our effective rate up top, which might help you to kind of calculate or see whether or not the points would be worthwhile, or do some comparison with the points. Then you could list the closing costs as well, if the closing costs were like $4,000. And you'll see a difference here between these two rates. The one up top not taking into consideration the closing costs, just the points. The second one is doing the closing costs as well. So those are the points. You can adjust that as we've seen in prior presentation. The fees for the points will calculate automatically. The rate down here will take into consideration the changes that might happen from the lender credit and the points changing in the rates. So this is the rate that would actually be used on the table, and it should populate automatically. The payment should calculate automatically based on the information up top. And then the total payment should calculate automatically, just taking that payment amount times the 360. So you shouldn't need to do anything to that. And then the interest rate for the total amount of the loan will just be the payments minus the loan of the 360, should populate automatically. We also have some information down below, because this is based on the idea of everything's being changing except the payment. So we see the payment calculation. You might want to say, I would like to keep everything else standard up top and then change one factor. So if we kept everything else the same up top and changed the years, 5, 10, 15, 20, and looked at the impact on the payment side by side, then you can change these as well. You can change the years to whatever you want and try to see what the payment would be on a side-by-side calculation, instead of changing one at a time. The terms up here, you could and you'll see the payment amount change here. So we're at 30 right now, 1932, 30, 1933. You could do the same for the home costs. You could say, okay, what if I bought more or less home and kept everything else constant? What would the payment amount be? Right here we're looking at the 400,000, which would be the 1933, 400,000, the 1933 about. And we could do the same thing for the rate. You say, well, what if we held everything else constant and then we changed the rate here? What would be the impact on the payment? So you can see that in a side-by-side fashion. I think it's 5%, 1933. That's where we stand right now. But you can see those more in a side-by-side kind of format. Then we got the calculation of the amortization table, which should populate automatically here. But if you needed to make any changes, we have the simplified format. This doesn't have the fancy formatting. So if you needed to change like the payment amount at some point in time, or say you had a higher payment that you wanted, like after second year, you wanted to change it to 3,000, you think you're going to increase the payment to 3,000 and you wanted to copy that down, you could do it a lot more easily here, because we're just using the simple formatting. If you scroll all the way down here, you're going to see that you have those negative numbers once the loan is paid down to 0, which happens right about there. So those negative numbers shouldn't be, too much of a problem. Those are the trade-offs between the formatting. If I undo that, we got this. Notice this loan goes down to the 30, the amortization table goes down to 40 time periods. And this loan stops at 30, so it goes to 0, and you got those negative numbers. That's the pros and cons of the fancy formatting. So you got these easy cell calculations here, easy reference. I can see what it's doing easily. I can see what this is doing fairly easily. I can see what this is doing fairly easily because I don't have long logic functions in it. But I have to deal with the fact that I got these negative numbers, and if I go all the way down to the bottom, then the total, the totals don't quite line up, although That's not a big problem because we see that the totals are up top. We don't have the check figure as much with the totals, which would be nice to have a check figure, but that's kind of the pros and cons of it there. You can always delete the added columns if you wanted to do that or something like that. We'll take a look at the formatting of the second cell to the second worksheet to look at that. So again, you could change any of these. You could change the rate to like 4% or something like that. You could change then the number of years to say a 15 year. It'll populate then down to the 15, obviously, and it should zero out at the 15. And then after that 15 year, it's going to go negative at that point, which is the annoying part, but shouldn't be too bad. Then we've got the IRR. If I bring this back to a 30 year, I calculated this kind of on the 30 year just to get an idea of it. That would be the standard, so you could see the calculation if you wanted to use that tool. So we got the loan amount. This should populate basically automatically. This first component, taking the loan amount and then taking into consideration like closing costs, lender credit, and points to see what the inflows and outflows would be, then looking at the flow and then calculate it on a 30-year time period to double check and prove the IRR calculation, which in this case, of course, is the 4% because that's the interest rate. So that's just the IRR. You could see how that's calculated just to look at that tool and then use that if you had any more kind of unusual situations. And then we've got the pivot table, which is going to be our standard pivot table. This is going to be broken out by years now. It goes all the way down to 40 years, but you could see the breakout of the pivot table. You want to refresh it, right click, refresh the pivot table. There's going to be our data. We have the same kind of problem with the negative numbers here, but you can get an idea on a year by year basis for the total payments, the interest, the sum of the loan. This is going to be a lot easier oftentimes when you want to see where you will stand at the end of like 9 years or something like that, rather than hunting around a 360 period pivot table or the 360 period amortization table. So that's the general template. We try to put most of the stuff in there. Notice if you go to the next tab, which has the formatting in it, then you scroll down to the bottom of this one, and it's going to remove those negatives at the bottom. That's the real main difference here. So if I go down here, the negatives are now zero. I didn't make them like blank cells because I don't really like doing that. But they've got zero. To do that, we've got these fancy logic functions, which again make it more complex if you needed to change something, but it makes it look a little bit nicer. It also allows you to have these check figures at the bottom, which may not be as important if you have a standard loan. But if I was to do something like change a payment up top, if I wanted to say after year 2, I wanted to say I'm going to increase the payment to $3,000, then I'd have to change everything that's in basically this cell, which is going to be F14. So everything that has F14 in it, I'd have to change to like 3,000. And then F14 is right there. I'm going to change that to 3,000. And then it should copy down. And that could help us because then the zeros will help us to give us the totals down below, which we need to calculate, which we can't calculate without basically the totals. We'd have to sum them up because that nice easy calculation over here on the totals won't work if we do like extra payments or something like that. To fix it, you could just simply copy this on down and it should bring it back to where it was before. So that's the only difference with the second one, fancy formatting. It could be a little bit more difficult if you needed to change this table or if you needed to change this cell. Those are the two cells that have the fancy formatting in them.